Michael, I'm honored to be co-hosting the middle of the show with a friend of the Tax Wall Street Party and our correspondent in Athens, Greece. This is the unbeatable Michael Chiotinis. Chiotinis has accurately called all of the main turning points in the struggle of the Greek government against the European Central Bank and the European Commission. His analysis has been correct and second to none for years now. Last week, Chiotinis covered Alexis Tsipras' trip to Moscow to meet Putin. Today, we want to do something special. Today, we decided that we want to arm you with the arsenal of arguments for your discussions on the situation with Greece. We thought that we would remind everybody of the basics and what's going on in Europe and why Greece is in the position it's in today. So, hello, Michael.
Hello, Daniela.
Hi. I'm going to start out with the first question. I think let's just jump in. Michael, how did the euro currency come to be? And we're going to go all the way back to the euro forming. So how did the euro currency come to be? And why is there a question now on whether it's going to break apart?
Well, let's take this from the beginning. Each European country had its own national currency up until 2002. In 2002, some of them joined what came to be called the Eurozone. They came under the umbrella of a common currency, in other words. Mm-hmm. The central bank issuing this currency is the European Central Bank, or the ECB, as you sometimes hear it, which is exactly like the Federal Reserve. It is private and, most importantly, independent of democratic institutions. Actually, its board of directors is made up of people from each individual country's central bank.
Okay, so they created an economic union as we understand it. We have this with the 7 Federal Reserve governors and the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks located in cities in different states. The New York Federal Reserve is obviously considered the most important because it's in the city with the strongest economy. So is this the same?
Yes. Now the problem is that when you bring together economies with such differences in competitiveness, in other words, the ability to produce cheaply, be it because of the level of technology, the level of wages, etc., you're going to have imbalances. Now, you will have lots of money coming in to, say, Germany, because, for example, they build the best mechanical equipment. And how can Greek industry compete with German industry given their level of technology? Mm-hmm. The only way for a weaker economy to deal with this used to be to devalue their currency. That was usually used to fix the imbalance, because when you devalue, the domestic product can compete with the imported one.
So can't they just increase German wages?
That's exactly what Germany did not do for the last decade or so. Say you want to have a monetary union. Anyway, okay, bring together these economies. Take the first step towards a federation, if you like. Well, then you need to have it crystal clear in your mind that every economy has its own place in the division of labor, the international division of labor or the European division of labor. What the European elites are failing to see is that you can't force 19 different national economies to become a copy of each other. And Germany being the most competitive, force 18 countries to be like Germany, you know?
Yeah, I want to explain this so Americans can understand, because I like to draw these parallels. I think the best way for Americans to think of European countries, I always say, are like states. Like, for example, California exports more produce than it imports, while Ohio has a steel industry, for example. Now, I have never thought, and I don't think any other Americans think of one state against another, having one state having trade deficits or trade surpluses. Obviously, this is mainly based on where the natural resources are and what the climate supports, meaning does that climate support that industry? But why do Europeans think of it this way, as separate?
That's actually a great question. That, I think, is because for Americans, this is self-evident. You have states in the U.S. that always had trade surpluses and always will have trade surpluses. And then you've got other states always having trade deficits. What's different in America are two things. Number one, the Federal government helps to even out these imbalances by giving incentives for industry to go and build factories at deficit areas, for example, like forcing defense contractors to build here or there. And number two, the United States tolerates state bankruptcies without this insane threat of an eviction from the dollar zone.
That's really funny and really clear. We would never evict somebody in a different state from the dollar.
You never had a governor or a state with a strong economy. A governor with a strong economy saying that another state must change its policy or be expelled from the dollar. That would be unthinkable for Americans. So what you need is something like that. You need to have a plan on how capital flows coming into Germany in the form of industry profits, because other countries are buying their product, return to the surrounding weaker countries in the form of investment.
Okay, so while we in America have different states with competing and complementary economies that are then balanced by the federal government, the Euro scheme never had that in its planning.
No, it didn't. What they actually did was leave this to the banks. Just leave it to the banks. And we all know what a mess the banks can bring once you give them the power to plan the economy. Once the profits came into Germany, they filled the German banks with deposits. Okay, money that these banks then had to somehow put to use somewhere. And of course, banks have no idea what productive investment is because, they're short-sighted by nature, by being banks.
Right. So, we know in America, too, what happens when the national economic planning is left to the bankers. I mean, that's been the history of our struggle here. So they give the funds to wealthy investors or stock jobbers, hedge fund, derivative sellers. So the European banking system did something similar, and then they obviously made a mess of it.
Predictably so. What they found was they could get great returns for this money if they lent it to the weaker states. And so these bubbles were formed. The banking bubble in Ireland is an example. The housing price bubble in Spain and the public debt in Greece. All of them examples of bubbles formed by money that had nowhere else to go.
Okay. So what are the trouble spots in Europe? Meaning, where do people want to see their money invested? Like here in the United States, it's obvious to us that we have terrible public transportation and we need urgent investment in crumbling infrastructure, and we have a lot of people out of work, etc. It goes on. We know what we need. How could Europe put people back to work? What investment do the European people want to see? What's the landscape over there?
Good question. I think that we need to think of Europe as a single economy, like America, and increase its competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And of course, not by cutting wages, rather by reviving the internal market. In other words, make Europeans able to buy European goods independent of what country they're in, what state. So that's number one. And number two is, for example, thinking of Greece as a hub. Ports, shipyards, and then fast rail. And then build modern networks of fast rail all over Europe to promote trade. Likewise, you can use every country's advantage for the good of all Europe as a whole.
Okay, Michael, we're going to a hard break. Let's continue this on the other side. You're listening to World Crisis Radio. Michael Chiotinis and Michael Chiotinis from Greece and I were just talking about banker tyranny, international banker tyranny. We're all subject to it. So what we need is to realize that we're all under banker tyranny.
Yes, we have been focusing on speculation rather than development. We in Europe and you in America.
Perfect. Michael, okay, So can you give us a view of how the euro came to be and how the bubbles grew to such an enormity that set the scene for the crisis? And what popped this bubble of runaway money from Germany? What happened there?
Well, that had to be the 2008 financial collapse. What else?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
right.
The markets, quote unquote, or certain groups of individuals associated with the markets decided that if the governments were going to bail out every banker who rings the finance ministry's doorbell, well, eventually you're going to have a crisis of public debt. So who was the weakest link in that respect? Of course, it was Greece. Now, in 2010, a speculative attack on its bond market deprived Greece of the ability to finance its public debt. In other words, the interest it had to pay in order to borrow became too high, and it couldn't afford to issue new bonds to repay the ones that were due. So Greece lost the ability to roll over its debt. At the time, the bulk of this debt was held by European banks, mostly German and French banks. What was normal to happen at that point was a Greek default and an inevitable haircut, along with a big investment program for all the weaker European states. But that would mean losses for the banks. And more importantly, possibly send a message to other weak European countries that they could do the same, meaning even more losses for the banks,
Yeah, I understand. I mean, the banks were huge, and I mean, they could handle losing some money, but that wasn't the issue. The issue, I think, was the banks had to send a message to the other small countries like Italy, Ireland, Spain, Portugal. The message, you kowtow to our austerity demands, or we'll not only attack your currency and bonds or your bond ratings, but we'll force you out of the economic union. What would happen if there was a haircut? Like, what would have happened if there was a haircut on the debts at that time in 2010?
Done by who? The government, such as those we have today, with the bank interest in mind. The panic triggered would certainly lead to a new round of bailouts for these banks, which was at the point very, very difficult politically. Now, we all know how much recent governments in the Western world love to give free money to bankrupt banks. But a direct bailout was, I think, politically hard for any politician at that point.
So instead, the Greek government at the time decided to take the bailout money offered by the Troika without addressing the systemic root of the Greek depression, meaning they were afraid of making demands of their own that would start a panic and they wouldn't get their bailout.
The systemic root, that's right, which was European, not Greek, because if it was Greek, then why did Portugal and Ireland got bailed out? And why is Spain and Italy in trouble? The problem is obviously European. But instead of addressing it, as you said, what they did was create the whole rhetoric about the bankrupt, lazy Greeks who need to be thrown out of the Eurozone because they didn't comply with several rules of the monetary union. Rules impossible to comply with, and rules that the Germans and French were the first to have violated.
Right. Like, that was all just the most awful part. So you mean that they were saying Greece violated their made-up rules for fiscal responsibility? They stressed criteria for Greece, but is there any regulation on what types of loans can be made? Meaning, Greece has to comply with certain economic standards set by the union, but what I don't understand is, do the banks?
That's a good point. Oh, good point. What we're talking about here is the Maastricht Treaty and what's called the Stability and Growth Pact, those sort of things. Well, the banks get to do whatever they want, as always. A banking union was never installed in the Eurozone so that you can deal with corrupt banks and bankrupt banks in a centralized manner. And as we already mentioned, there was, and still is, no investment policy. That's the important part. Now, what matters is that these criteria for the governments could be met. They just couldn't. Mm-hmm. You can't force an economy to be what you want it to be. It has a dynamic of its own. And most importantly, the rules were written by people who thought that something like the 2008 financial crash was impossible. The models didn't predict a crash, so why prepare for it? They thought the bubbles would last forever, and they were lovely creations of the free market, increasing productivity in mysterious ways. Well, back to the point. Let me go back to the point. The main thing is to understand is that they coerced the Greek government to accept a huge loan from the European taxpayer in order to meet payments to the bondholders, effectively bailing out the banks and leaving the Greek taxpayer indebted to the European taxpayer, creating friction between them and leaving the European taxpayer having to take the hit of an inevitable haircut. Because, of course, Greece can't possibly ever pay back.
I mean, and how could it? Because the economy being in such bad shape because of austerity and deflationary policies. So austerity comes into play big time here. Can we go into that for a second?
Yes. What they also did was impose austerity, as you pointed out.
Right.
And policies that would destroy and have destroyed the Greek economy, making it even less able to pay, as you correctly pointed out.
So, okay. Let's give a quick recap. I would say at this time, so the German banks pushed their excess currencies onto the smallest countries in the European Union. And you correct me as I go along, because I'm going to try to recap. Then the 2007 economic depression hits, and the depression is exported onto the bond markets of these same small countries. When those countries can't pay or roll over their debts, the EU provides Greece with a loan to pay back the bankers, demanding that the government implement extreme austerity. The government puts the lives of people at risk so the banks don't take a loss. That's the priority. The banks don't take a loss. On top of all that, the rest of the European community then took the vile name-calling of you guys, the Greeks, and threats against the Greek people. They called the Greeks lazy and suggested they brought it on themselves. I was reading recently that Greece has the highest number of annual work hours of all employees in the EU. So calling the Greeks lazy is factually beyond incorrect. They said Greeks are poor and want something for nothing, but Greece is a developed country, and you guys had the highest standard of living with I was reading too, I wrote down this fact, a ranking of 29 worldwide in 2012. Mm-hmm. And so they're making all these slanders against Greece, which was part of the propaganda to blame it on you guys. And then they had the gall to talk about European solidarity. Like, well.
European solidarity, yes, it's Orwellian. This was never a bailout of Greece. It was once again a bank bailout. In fact, 96% of the money lent to Greece never even made it to Greece. It was immediately directed towards these big banks, the bondholders.
Let's just put that in all caps so everybody remembers this. This was never a bailout of Greece. It was a bank bailout. And so you're saying 96% of the money never came back to Greece. Never made it back to Greece.
Yes, it was just loans to pay back previous loans.
We were told in the news, we're going to go to a break. I hear the music starting, and we'll continue with this on the other side. Thank you for being with us, Michael, and giving us this overview. You've been listening to World Crisis Radio, of the party. And before the break, we had Reverend Pinkney, which was wonderful to have him get through. I'm so happy that happened. And before that, we were talking about, just to remind the audience, I think my favorite line that helps me put this all in perspective is, this was never a bailout of Greece. This was a bailout of the banks. And also you said, Michael, before the break, that 96% of the money was never made it to Greece. 96% of the money involved in all of this never made it back to Greece.
Absolutely. It was just money coming in to pay back the bondholders. In other words, loans to pay back previous loans.
We were told in the news that there had been a haircut, that those poor bankers had to put up, with the lazy Greeks not willing to pay back their debts. What was behind all that?
Yeah, they gave it a name too. It was called the PSI, meaning private sector involvement.
Can you describe this a little more? I understand the private investors were told to take a 50% haircut in the PSI agreement of the face value of Greek government bonds that they were holding. The equivalent was an overall loss of about 75%. Was this just something that affected private investors and not the central bank or the European taxpayer? Can you unravel all that, what I'm trying to say?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. It took place 2 years, this haircut, 2 years after this huge loan was first signed. By then, half of the debt had already been paid back in full, 100 cents on the dollar, and the banks were now ready to take the hit. But this haircut concerned only the part of the debt that remained in the hands of private institutions, mostly by then vulture funds who bought these bonds cheap, looking to make a killing. Buy it cheap and sell it something else. The rest of it, the part of the debt held by the European institutions created to quote unquote bail out Greece, never got a haircut. So the European.
So what was the cut? Was half of the public debt? Okay, let me simplify that. So let's simplify for people to understand. Was it a 25% haircut, and that wasn't enough? Meaning that wasn't enough for them. The 25% haircut, is that your point? The remaining debt was still unsustainable.
Yes, yes, exactly. I have 4 points on that, Daniela.
Okay,
Number one, the haircut didn't even compensate for the shrinking of the economy due to the austerity imposed as terms for this loan. Number two, the haircut mainly served as a looting mechanism for public pension funds, which needed to be protected from a haircut, because what's the point of a haircut anyway? Certainly not to shoot yourself in the foot. When you default, the idea is to point the gun towards the foreign lender, not the domestic. That's what's happened to every state default in history. But of course, sovereign defaults are usually administered by the state, the sovereign state, not by the lender, as happened in the case of Greece. Number three, the haircut was accompanied by yet another huge loan, a big part of which was the funds needed to recapitalize the Greek banks hit by the haircut. So part of what was cut was borrowed again, like taking it from one pocket and putting it into your other pocket. And number four, the haircut came with yet another round of austerity, further shrinking the economy that will be called upon to pay back both the new debts and the old ones.
Okay, so those are their points. I mean, the main point is that austerity is self-defeating and doesn't work, and that Greece was never bailed out anyway. We talked about it above. I mean, austerity actually decreases an economic recovery because so many minute factors of the economy are included in government spending, education, roads, social safety nets, not to mention the economic factors coming from political decisions. When those are cut so drastically, and like it harms the people who are the real basis of a strong economy, regardless of the value of the people builds the value, and the value of the infrastructure builds the value of the economy. So regardless of whether they are in the public or private sector, and the Greek situation is emblematic of this fact. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Let me give you the simple facts, Daniela. Okay. Greece entered the crisis with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 110% and around 10% unemployment. It was put through a program to supposedly tackle the debt issue, the 110% debt to GDP ratio debt issue. Well, 5 years and several thousand suicides later, unemployment stands at 30%, from 10 to 30, and debt to GDP is at 180%, having been haircut, for crying out loud. So, to sum up the basics, Greece was never bailed out, the European banks were. And the haircut caused more problems than it solved, because it wasn't really a haircut. It was a looting of social security and public pension funds that are mandated by law to invest in government bonds, the deposits in government bonds.
Okay. So what's going on now? Let's wrap up this last segment, and then I have to take a few guests. But what's going on right now? Is there going to be a euro breakup? How do you see that going? Could you explain that in detail for us?
In my opinion, the euro is a very important strategic direction for the German elites, who are at this moment unquestionably dominant over European economic policy. The tool of this hyper-dominance, in my view, is this common currency, the euro. Simply consider the following. In the year 2000, before the euro was introduced as a physical currency, 27% of German exports were to countries that would become the Eurozone. That's the year 2000. In 2009, 44% of German exports were to Eurozone countries. In other words, from 27% to 44%. Also, the euro has brought streams of capital flows into the German banking system and lowered the cost of borrowing for every individual institution in Germany, giving them a competitive edge, because businesses in Germany have a lower borrowing cost than in Greece, for example. Coupled with the wage stability in very low levels for German workers, what you get is a powerful elite exploiting of industrialists and financiers, exploiting German workers while making them pay for the bailout of German banks, selling them the narrative that they are bailing out the lazy Greeks. Mm-hmm. Considering all this, I think the Germans would never risk the end of the common currency. A so-called Brexit, in other words, in terms of Greece to the national currency, would inevitably bring an existential crisis for Europe itself.
Michael, I hear the music. Thank you for being with us, and you'll be on next week when Webster Tarpley returns to provide us with your amazing analysis. And thank you for being with us and to being a friend of the party. Talk to you soon, Michael.